So when I get enervated, I'm a terrible swear. So if I do that, you'll just have to, okay.
Great.
So
You're among friends.
Okay, I just opened this list of questions. Now, do you want me just to start responding to these? Because I could just extemporaneously just start picking questions or replying, or
I would say no, because I think that people, since we've written these a week ago, people have had time to think about it and might want to ask them differently or even ask entirely different questions. So we'll just pass it off to the first person on the list. Andrew, you want to ask your question?
Yeah, hi Joel.
Hey.
I had a question about, I guess, just if over the past 2 years, because I would presume, I mean, it came out in 2018, so you probably wrote this 2016, 17.
Earlier, in fact, but that's, yeah, sorry.
Okay, perfect. So I was wondering if through that time, since the criticism or even just seeing how the world has changed, especially when it comes to climate, a lot of things change really fast. I was wondering if you were to write it today, what major changes you would have, or is there any observations in the world recently that would have you make a different analysis of the situation? Especially because climate, like it seems like every year something new happens. Even though your frameworks are very good, especially when, like, I don't think anything will change with green capitalism and as an analytical tool. But I was wondering if there was anything in the past couple of years that, if you were to write a new edition, that you would input.
Great question. Thank you, Andrew. I mean, I suppose every writer feels that as soon as you see the book in print, you start to shake your head and wish that you had done many things differently. And as you know, a lot has changed in the last few years in certain respects. For instance, we wrote most of the book prior to Trump's election. So that was a big one. And immediately after Trump was elected, some of our interlocutors, people who we debate ideas with, folks who understood what we had been doing and didn't quite buy the argument, pointed out that Trump's election invalidated our claim because it clearly meant that Climate Leviathan was not, in fact, imminent. So we kind of went through a round of that and explained that no, in fact, Trump's election demonstrated to us that what we characterize as a civil war between Leviathan and Behemoth is actually still a decent analytical explanation of the present global conjuncture. And we're just seeing what it looks like in the United States. I mean, that campaign, it was almost like the paradigmatic forms of Leviathan versus Behemoth, with Hillary Clinton versus Donald Trump. And fine, Trump won, but it was pretty clear immediately that Behemothism, as represented by the politics of Donald J. Trump, was not in fact hegemonic within the US and wouldn't last forever. So we felt, like that wasn't necessarily to say that we were wrong. It's just that this civil war may last a while, so that's one thing that I think we probably should have said more clearly in the book, is that we didn't mean to suggest that just because a new form of politics is imminent and, as we claim, hegemonic, that doesn't mean that it's about to arrive like 6 months later. It's a bit like at the end of Capital, Marx says, capitalism is a social formation that historically and politically and economically speaking produces fundamental contradictions, and these will eventually play out in such and so fashion. And there are like serious thinkers who read that and say, well, if he said that in 1867 and it hasn't happened by 2022, then ipso facto he's wrong. And I just think that kind of thinking is senseless, partly because actually the descriptions of the contradictions he describes are so clearly at play in the world. So I think in a similar way, Jeff and I should have said more like about how we actually see that this global planetary war between the Behemothian versus Leviathanathic potential paths of our futures might last for some time. So we should have been much clearer about that, I think. Another one, since you mentioned Mao, is that I think both with respect to the Mao and Behemoth scenarios, we didn't say enough. We just didn't provide the reader enough. So we receive a lot of both criticisms. Basically, people who are really interested in the potential of a revolutionary planetary sovereign say, well, you didn't really go far enough there. You should have really fleshed out climate Maoism, if that's what you're fending for, et cetera. And, I fully accept that criticism. That's true. So I think that's work that's still to be done. Although I must say quite a few really brilliant people have essentially done that for us since Leviathan is out. In fact, in the pre-round when we were suggesting books, I mentioned the latest book by my friend Andreas Malm, who someone else suggested his coronavirus book. I would put even ahead of that the book he did with the Zetkin Collective on race and what I would call global behemoth and revolutionary counter strategies. I mean, to be candid with you, I think Andreas is proposing climate Leninism, and he's not a Maoist. He has his own reasons to call it climate Leninism, not climate Maoism, but it's definitely the lower left quadrant, 100%, right up to and including geoengineering, incidentally. So, you know, he's a comrade of mine and an interlocutor and a friend, but we just disagree politically on that strategy. But I would have liked to say more about that. The other one is behemoth. I mean, I think that much more needs to be said there. And there too, some really brilliant people have written essays that are intended as complements, I think, to our framework. That several of these, I might give you the references if you're interested, but basically the premise of the essays is to say that the basic framework is correct, that it's planetary sovereignty and capitalism that are the fundamental determinants of the future political condition, et cetera, et cetera. But unfortunately for Wainwright and Mann, they're wrong that planetary sovereignty is going to emerge. We're going to remain stuck in this world of capitalist nation states fighting intra-imperialist wars, and it's just going to become barbaric and terrible. And so we need a proper theory of climate barbarism. And in hindsight, I kind of wonder if Jeff and I were just a little too brief about that, because we just felt there wasn't much to say, because it's so obvious to us that if we end up on that path, then we're really fucked. We're doomed. I mean, humanity is. In that scenario, there's no hope. And so, but that's actually a poor excuse, as we all know, not to theorize and explain it. Like, as leftists, we still have to stare into the abyss. So I'm sorry if that was a bit of a long answer, but those are the things I think I wish I had elaborated upon. We had elaborated upon for most.
Long answers are very good.
Good.
We're happy to receive those.
Okay.
And that brings me to my question here. The climate Mao, and I've always pronounced it behemoth. Is it behemoth?
That's fine. Take your pick.
I wonder if and I'm interested in this book that you're recommending. I wonder if you could elaborate on these, because that was the most pressing question coming out of the book in our conversations was, what does this mean? Like, what is the connection to Mao? What does climate Mao mean? What does a non-value form sovereignty look like, and why have the authors attached it to Mao? And then a similar question with behemoth, but first with Mao.
Mao more than ever. Start with Mao. Always start with Mao. I'm just making a couple quick notes here. Another great question. So a lot of people have criticized us for calling that lower left squadron climate Mao, and some of my friends have even said that it is quote unquote Orientalist. I mean, in the 1979 Edward Said book sense, like as if since we end up criticizing it and not choosing sides with it by bringing Mao into the conversation and speaking of it as a phenomenon with a real political potential, specifically in the continent of Asia, then, you know, it's Orientalism. I mean, I reject that claim, but I can understand why people would feel that way. I think part of the reason that we get sort of brushed with that sort of criticism is because, to be perfectly candid with you, since I think most of the people in this conversation are from North America, we in this part of the world do not take Maoism very seriously as a political force historically, which is amazing because it was a huge factor in the 20th century, not only in China, and remains that way. In fact, I'm convinced that demographically, if you took a poll of all the people around the world who consider themselves to be Marxist of one form or another, and then you put them in buckets to divide them out politically, that there would be more people in the Maoist bucket than any other bucket. I mean, it's a simple fact of demography. But when was the last time at a book club like this, someone, for instance, said, well, you know, maybe we should read the Little Red Book and talk about how it relates to what's going on in Nepal or something? I mean, honestly, in my experience, most people who say those sorts of things are immediately put outside of acceptable discourse. They are regarded as crazy. Okay, so that's just the preliminary. So in other words, partly it's just basically as a way of saying, like, come on, left, like, let's look around and, you know, consider things a little differently. Let's just not keep going back to Lenin and Trotsky and so forth again and again and think about other possibilities. But that's just the beginning. There's other serious reasons. One of which is that, again, we're both geographers. Jeff and I both teach in geography departments. And we have to think about who in the world and where in the world people are presently suffering the violence of climate change. And, the data here are unambiguous. Although we often associate effects of climate change with coastal areas in general, and therefore, island states are a big deal, the Caribbean, for instance. But when you start to look at numbers of people, there's no question that East Asia, South Asia, and Southeast Asia already have by far the most number of people in the world who are really suffering from climate change. And the data suggests that in our lifetimes, that entire part of the world is certain to undergo major environmental and therefore, I think, political and economic change as well. And of course, it's the center of the most people in the world. And now with China's rise, also, home to a state with a huge, complex political revolutionary tradition, which could go in any number of ways. So those are just some of those. But now, as for Mao himself, if we ask ourselves this basic question, like, what did Mao really contribute as a thinker to Marxism as a tradition? It's a divisive question. I mean, I've heard many people say nothing. He was basically a monster. I mean, even among leftists, sometimes people think this. And I think, I won't speak for Jeff on this point, but I'll say I reject this. I mean, as a thinker, Mao made a few critical interventions into Marxist thinking, but certainly the most important was that he basically just rejected the idea that the proletariat was a unique social class for capitalism as a revolutionary social group. I mean, which is not a minor point. I mean, Marx himself didn't really waver much on this. The peasantry was not revolutionary. The proletariat was. So for Mao to modify that fundamentally and then, quote unquote, demonstrate it, realize it historically was no minor matter. So how does that relate to climate change, though? Are we suggesting that therefore climate Mao is going to be based on a peasant-based revolutionary theory? No, but it's based on a more fundamental insight. Mao said that the peasantry could be revolutionary, but he didn't say all peasants are revolutionary. He divided them famously into a couple different groups. Remember the poor peasant, the middle peasant, the rich peasant? And then behind that thinking, he says, because it's not like all of any class is revolutionary. He didn't think like all proletariats were revolutionary. He said the question is a political one as well as economic. You have to think of it in terms of a matrix. Where can ideology, organization, leadership, massification, et cetera, mobilize certain class groups? And I think that sort of thinking is actually what a lot of people on the left have intuitively figured out we need to do with respect to climate change and the planetary crisis. We can't do that kind of old class determinist thing where like, and then the proletariat will, does anyone see there? It's already begun. Sorry. Does anyone seriously believe that the proletariat, qua proletariat as a social class are automatically going to confront climate change in a revolutionary way? I don't think so. So that's an insight that Mao didn't shy away from. He's like, obviously not. It's all about doing a kind of dynamic analysis of how politics and economics intersect. So that's just the kind of, sorry again if this is going on too long, but I'm just trying to give you a sense of like why we would have called it Mao at all. Because, we first called it Climate Lenin, which is probably no surprise to anyone. For a long time, when we drew that square, it was Leviathan versus Lenin on the left. And then at a certain point, we're like, no, we got to talk about Mao and Maoism. But we saw that this could throw people off. And
because
in fact,
Lenin, sorry to interrupt, because Lenin confronted that problem, but did not come up with the same solution as Mao.
Yeah, you could say, Lenin never adopted as much of he was never of the view that Mao later adopted that said that the poor and middle peasants could be and should be revolutionary subjects. So far as I'm aware, Lenin never came to that position. His view remained, the hegemony of the proletariat with the support of the peasantry right to the end. Maybe he changed his mind in one of those last notes, like the famous one where he, said, don't pick Stalin. Maybe someone will find a fragment of it. In the main, no, that was Lenin through and through. Okay, so now back to, so I want to say one more thing about this. One of the earliest, we started to kind of present these arguments in various universities, and one of the first places that we presented it was UC Berkeley. And the whole conversation became about why we were talking about Mao and Maoism at all. And basically the argument was like, you can't do that. You're just not allowed to. Even in Berkeley, like you just can't do it, which was kind of shocking, actually. We sort of felt like there was we hadn't expected like the repression and censorship of it. And so, but frankly, I'm being very candid with you. It kind of scared us as writers. We're like, fuck, the whole book is going to get shot down because we use that word, Maoism. And we're not even Maoists. You understand? We're just trying to be sensible and honest about things like, demographic facts and geography and history. And so we retreated. And for a while we thought, well, we don't want to just keep going back to Lenin, et cetera, et cetera. It makes everyone think about the Russian Revolution again at the 100th anniversary. So we decided, let's go back to the roots and we'll Climate Robespierre. And it was going to be Climate Robespierre. And then we were like, no, this is dumb. Like, look what we're doing. We're just going back again to the same, what does Marx say in the 18th Brumaire? We keep fighting the new struggles in the costumes of the old. We're like, no. Okay, okay, now I don't think I've answered your question though, which is like, the real question here is the substantive one, is like, what about the strategy, the revolutionary strategy of anti-capitalist planetary sovereignty? First, let's be clear about what this means. We build a social movement globally. So I'm going to try and pitch it now. Here's my like car salesman version of this. So we need a movement to overthrow capitalism immediately because it's the source of the crisis. But if we try to do that, we have to recognize that capitalism is global. Therefore, we need a counterpart, which is equally global. And furthermore, because climate change presents itself to us as an incapacity to organize rapid decarbonization while also delivering radical social change that meets the needs of the poor, as well as building seawalls and facilitating mass organized migration of hundreds of millions of people, all in the short term. Folks, there's only one way to do that, and that's to have a de facto state power that operates qua planetary sovereign. These are facts. You need that. Therefore, the left builds that, and that becomes essentially a form of Climate Leviathan, but which is anti-capitalist. In such a scenario, the revolutionary subject would not be just the proletariat, but would be essentially the people of the world, coming together, all together to create a new kind of order. Okay, that's the pitch. You can kind of see the logic of it. When I put it to you like that, you can see why it's actually much closer to Mao ideologically than Lenin, because it's talking about the people and order and massification and state and so forth and so on. Don't forget that one of the things that also distinguished Mao is that he believed that Marxism required a kind of almost military-like massification of society where everyone was combined into a great general will, right? That's what I think the left implicitly endorses when it goes down the path of thinking about for instance, a planetary solution to the capitalist ecological crisis through things like, the reordering of the planet through something like a global state, which is revolutionary. Although we don't, you see, this is the thing is I'm grasping for words here because this strategy doesn't actually exist in the sense that like you can't point to social movement organizations that are like trying to do this. But I know for a fact that it really exists because when we talk as comrades about what we're going to do, these ideas are very clearly in people's minds as like, well, what we would really need to do. And so what we wanted to say in the book is, let's think this through. Let's think this through. What does that actually mean? Are we prepared to build a planetary sovereign which is anti-capitalist? And I think there's many reasons why we should be deeply concerned about that. Let me just give you one very concrete point where I think we on the left can run, but we can't hide. Because this debate, there's a way in which any kind of discourse, ideology, or debate ends up being inflected by how it comes into people's lives, right? So here's one where it's coming soon. Planetary geoengineering. There's a serious debate now, for instance, in the United States about the funding of geoengineering research. Should the left get behind this or not? Andreas Malm just edited a book called Has It Come to This? Which essentially is, as far as I would describe it, like an endorsement of a left strategy for geoengineering. Our response to that would be to say, okay, what is going to be the sovereign that decides when we, start putting the particles in the atmosphere? This is not an abstract question. This is the kind of concrete question by which we're going to confront these politics. And, you could say that perhaps because we're too anarchistic, or because we simply don't think it's a viable political strategy, or because we think that ultimately it would lead to some kind of radically undemocratic form, like extremely undemocratic form of revolutionary anti-capitalism. For any one of those reasons, I mean, you could put it however you want. Jeff and I do not endorse such a strategy. And obviously many comrades disagree with this, and we respect that. But if there's any merit to what we've said about that quadrant at all, it's simply by talking about it in a way that people can at least understand some of the stakes. Okay, again, another long question. At this rate, we're going to get through 3 questions, so I'll stop there.
Next question, Zach. Go ahead.
Sure, thanks. So my question is, how do we kind of, what's the between space? What is the transition from, where we are now with a lot of climate movements, which are very local, very, individual based on like a specific deforestation or specific pipeline? What's the between space between that and kind of like a real climate X that is kind of gone into, because I think there's a vision of like this global movement that's really effectively opposing, climate change and capitalism, and you can see that like in a purely hypothetical way. But what's harder for me to imagine is the between, is like the transition between that and where we're at now.
Absolutely, Zach. You're not alone in this. I teach classes at the university here about climate justice, and I hear this comment a lot from my students. And I think that the reason, and from other climate activists as well, and I think the reason that we have this difficulty has nothing to do with any personal failure on your part or anyone's part, but reflects a real contradiction, which is that for us to build social movement organizations, social movement institutions, because social movements aren't just individuals, right? They're things that have groups and parties and so forth and so on, would require, because so much of the struggle is about the organization of the means of production, specifically in the energy system, it requires making a leap almost on day one to like controlling the power supply. And this is not a minor point. Like, what do we do about that? So to draw a parallel, like if you are in the feminist movement, you can begin to activate feminist ideas to an extent where you can even feel like you're part of something revolutionary in your immediate daily life by confronting issues in your social relationships. If you are a labor organizer, you can begin to confront power at your workplace by organizing a union tomorrow. If you are a climate activist who wants to overthrow fossil fuel capitalism, what the fuck do you do tomorrow with 5 or 6 friends? Right? I mean, that's basically how the problem presents to us. And then in addition to this, there's another issue, which is that, of course, coming back to the previous question, we know that liberalism has an answer. You can consume a little differently, but that's not going to get you very far, either in terms of changing global capitalism or in terms of building the wins and solidarity and so forth that are necessary for social movement organizations to begin to take off. You can't really build without some wins. So there's something else that has to be said, though, which is the reason we wrote the book, really, which is that's a nice excuse, and it's a good like political economy explanation of what's going on. But there's something else that needs to be said, which concerns political ideas, which is that having been part of the climate justice movement such as it existed since 1992, when I did my first climate activism stuff, I have to say, I have been struck at how long it has taken, especially in North America, and particularly in the United States, how long it has taken to what my young mind saw as obvious, radicalization on questions of capitalism to kind of emerge within the movement. I mean, it has taken so long, and without a vibrant left generally, which we obviously do not have in the United States, and without a lot of people in a climate movement who are reading Marx or thinking about capitalism in a sophisticated way, what has happened in my view is that again and again, good discussions on the question you've asked, Zach, fall back into some really weak ideas, frankly, really weak thinking. And so in the book, the way we try and frame this positively, and you can tell me if it fails or not, it's totally sincere, but as writers, you have to write in a way where you're trying to reach your audience and not just say, you don't have good ideas, because that's a loser. So what we said, which we genuinely believe, is that the left collectively has failed to produce a vision and a theory of how we're actually going to win this fight. And that part of what we're trying to do is to contribute to that. And I think, if I'm honest with you, that's the level, the basic level at which we're all in this struggle today. Before we can, shut down gas stations or end fossil fuel subsidies, we have to be able to articulate what is it we're fighting for? What is the basis for our social movement at all? This is a real struggle. Did I answer your question, Zach?
Think as well as could be asked.
Okay.
Honestly, it's a hard one.
I'll take that as a no. That's good. I'll take it. That's good. Maybe the next time. Okay, let me say one more thing then, since that was dissatisfying. So this is more optimistic, perhaps. This is a question for you. So Greta Thunberg changed this conversation. Like, give credit where it's due. How? By not going to school. It's amazing fact. Think about this. So Greta Thunberg's gesture was to not go to school and sit outside with her climate strike sign. But what that communicated was, on one hand, the claim that youth as a category could be radical, which is in itself, that was a big step forward, because although there was a lot of talk about future generations, it was always abstract. And let's admit it, like, we on the left, Marxists in particular, have never said that such and so age group is revolutionary. But basically Greta comes forward and she's like, yes, we are. Well, other youth did that too. But what specifically then gave that so much power was her question, which was, if what you're saying is true, and basically we're doomed if we don't change how we all live immediately, then why should I even go to school? And that is the logic of the general strike. If you think it through, what Greta was saying is like, if we don't all stop working and buying and living our lives as if nothing's wrong, then we're all doomed. Therefore, we should. And that resonated with people. So why do I bring that up now? Because I think that in a world where there were more gestures, questions, and groups that were putting forth ideas like that, we might be able to suture the gap between the small group of people who want to do something but don't know how to get to taking down fossil fuel capitalism. But we don't have that yet. I hope that's a little better. Anyway, next question.
Yeah, great. Adam.
I'm gonna pass my question on to Pat.
All right, so me. Yeah, this is a question that came up. Do you participate in any climate activism yourself? And if so, or if not, what actions do you see worthy or worth doing for political orgs or individual activists to take part in right now that you see actually making a difference or working towards that vision, that left vision?
Okay, great question. So over the years, I mean, going back for, let's say in round numbers, 30 years, I've done a lot of climate activism, but most of it is so conventional.
And obviously, if you've blown up any pipelines,
No.
leave that out.
No, I'm not that brave, to be honest with you. Most of the stuff that I've done is so conventional and boring that, because to be honest, a lot of activism is kind of, like that I won't elaborate. You can just use your imagination. But I will say this, in 1993, this is a whole nother conversation, so I won't go into it deeply, but in 1993, I had the privilege of spending a few months in Central America, specifically in Belize, and then after I got out of college, I moved back to Belize and lived there for a year. And at the point I arrived, there was a major conflict between the state, the post-colonial state, and the Kekchi and Mopan people of the southern part of the country, indigenous communities, over the fate of the ancestral lands of the indigenous people, the rainforest that they live in. And I essentially dropped everything and spent the next year working as a activist / participant / assistant to some of the movement leaders. And it was a formative experience in my life, as you can imagine. And then as fate would have it, I ended up writing a PhD about the colonization of those lands and spent several more years on the ground working with communities on various issues related to forest change. And then I started a movement organization with some friends there. So for a long time, and really in a way almost to the present day, I think some of the best work that I've done as an activist, as opposed to a writer or a teacher, has been to really stay with it in one very specific struggle over what is really not a very big space, and so one of the things I would say is that if there's anything to learn from my life about the effectiveness of activism, it concerns really staying with a specific community of subaltern groups, meaning people who are exploited or otherwise disempowered, marginalized, disenfranchised, racialized, etc. Because the bonds of solidarity and also the intelligence and whatever you have to contribute both become stronger over time, and often the best work just takes decades to, and I wouldn't have known any of that when I was 20 and I started getting involved in this. But then if someone looked at me from the outside and they're like, okay, prove to me that all that work you've done for Belize has done anything good for climate change, I'd be the first to say, oh no. Because actually, like most struggles on the left, we've lost more battles than we've won to begin. And in the second place, even the ones that we've won don't necessarily translate directly into trees saved, although that's certainly the case in some places. As for what is to be done, I mean, as you can gather from my previous answer, I think the first one is find a way to commit yourself for the long term for specific struggles, because that really matters. Like this idea that like we're all going to do everything is just ridiculous. But I think with respect to climate change, I think that there is a great deal to be said about the fact that we need today more than anything else to inspire people to the idea that a collective struggle against fossil fuel capitalism is possible. And I know that sounds like idealism, but until we begin to chip away on that one, then we really don't have much hope. So my fear as I'm sure you all know, speaking of Andreas Malm again, he wrote a really powerful book I teach in one of my classes called How to Blow Up a Pipeline, in which he advocates confrontational tactics, specifically sabotage against fossil fuel infrastructure. At the level of philosophy and ethics, I have absolutely no problem with that. I mean, I think he makes a very compelling case. At the level of strategy, I have serious doubts. Here in Ohio, where I live, which is very much a fossil fuel state, sitting on top of a big natural gas field, there's a lot of coal still. Energy is one of the biggest sources of not only obviously electrical power, but fossil fuel industry, one of the major supporters of job sectors, industries, wealth, money, you know what I'm trying to say. It's huge here. The Republican Party is essentially a fossil fuel party here. Given the actual demographic state of Ohio, if I went and started blowing up pipelines here, I would be immediately seen as a crazy eco-terrorist, and that would be the end of the story. End of story. So, and furthermore, it would fuel a right-wing reaction that would probably make it much more difficult for quote-unquote ordinary left liberal people who care about climate to do anything ever. And those, I think, are real strategic decisions we have to make. So, but when we ask the question about like, okay, great, so we need real coalition building that goes beyond just, stuff on Facebook or whatever. Yes, but then we come back to the problem of what's our theory and what's our grounds. And I hope it doesn't sound like, it probably does. It sounds like I'm one of those people who says like, first we get our political theory straight and then everything falls into place. I'm like, we definitely do not believe that. That is not our view. But I do think you have to have at least like a narrative, a vision, a story. And one of the reasons we felt we had to write the book is because we feel like, if we're really honest, to the extent that we have a climate justice movement in the US and Canada today, it is pushing for Climate Leviathan. It is totally operating on the horizon of capitalism. And it is effectively calling for so-called global solutions to the collective action problem by blah, blah, blah. And we know where that will go. We will end up with a world that will not resolve the fundamental problem of climate change, but will essentially create a planetary sovereignty to manage the aftermath with an intensified capitalism, profiting off the process. I mean, I don't know about you, but if that's true, if what we're saying in that claim has any validity, then we have a problem at the level of like political organizing, if that's our concern, because I'm not going to go organize for that. But I think a lot of people on the left who really want Climate X have basically fallen into the trap of cheerleading for the opposite. Incidentally, that was actually why we wrote the book, is because this is just a quick aside, and then we'll have one more long answer. But going back to Copenhagen, do you remember the Copenhagen COP summit? It was way back in 2009. Okay, so so for many years, the U.S. was effectively out of the negotiations. Never totally stopped participating, but then for all practical purposes, the U.S. was sitting on the outside of the COP meetings, throwing rotten tomatoes inside and trying to interrupt everything. And then Obama was elected in 2008. And then famously, he comes out on stage in Chicago with his family that night and he says, and the waters will stop rising. And, this is interpreted to be like, okay, great. So U.S. leadership is back, and liberals across the world were, expecting the U.S. to come to the next COP meeting and say, have we got a deal? The Democrats even controlled the Congress at the time. Well, of course, what happened was not quite so good. Obama went to Copenhagen and undermined whatever you might think of as the possibility of genuine progress, even within that limited forum. Well, in the run-up to that Copenhagen meeting, there was a kind of a spasm of activism in North America about climate, like has never happened before or since. All the green groups were out trying to say, okay, we're going to show Obama this is really going to happen. And so separately, both Jeff and I were asked to give public talks at rallies. Jeff's a Canadian. He lives in Vancouver. He stood up and spoke at one of these events in Vancouver, and I did the same here in Ohio. And afterwards we talked, and we realized that what both of us were saying was, look, if we're cheering for the elite to go to Copenhagen and produce the plan that we expect them to produce, which is essentially, incidentally, it did come together, but it took until Paris. We're like, if that's what we're cheering for, then what we're calling for is the emergence of a climate Leviathan. And what we need is a climate Lenin. And of course, we talked about this and we realized, like, what the hell is a climate Lenin? And is that something we really believe? And at that point, we realized two things. One, we didn't really believe in climate Lenin, which means we didn't know what we believed in. And secondly, we realized that this was probably not just like a random problem of two people, but it was symptomatic of the state of the movement. And therefore, it might be helpful just to try and sort out like where the different parties stand. So the whole thing, the whole book project was really, in the first instance, a kind of elaborate form of self-clarification. Okay, I'll stop there.
Great answer. Thank you. Patrick S.
Yeah, I'm really unhappy with the formulation of this question, so I'll give it a shot. Okay. So like something that I think about often is that climate, like our climate, is like a very universal thing that affects everyone, right? And in some way. You could say capitalism does the same thing to some degree, but obviously unequally. I think climate change will do the same thing. So it'll have unequal effects over time on various classes of people. But it seems that when we're talking about organizing around climate change or like activism around climate issues, it's really easy for those to be co-opted by liberalism or some other force, precisely because it's a universal issue that everybody can sort of jump on and say, oh, I'm affected by it. I might be a wealthy landowner, but I'll put some money towards this. And there's nothing in there inherently that seems to rile up any sort of anti-capitalist force. Oftentimes it feels to me that we'd be better served focusing on the anti-capitalist aspect of this, right? Rather than the climate. Now, obviously climate is going to affect us all and we have to live on the planet. So like you can't just ignore it. But I think I'm not sure how to formulate a question around this, but it seems so often that these movements go more towards the climate side of things and there is no anti-capitalism in there. It just sort of evaporates out of it. So I'm not sure if you see any fruit in building that anti-capitalist movement first, right? With obviously climate roots or something, or like roots with that as a part of it. But yeah. No,
it's I heard two different questions, and I'll take the first one that I heard second. But on your last point, do we need more anti-capitalism in the climate movement? Of course, yes, absolutely. I would maybe quibble with your formulation only where you say, first we become anti-capitalist and then the climate movement. Like, even if such a thing was possible, we don't have the luxury of waiting because climate change is already happening here and causing a lot of violence and damage. So the difficult question becomes, how do we confront since it's really, I hope this doesn't sound like some kind of Hegelian trick. It's not, it's reality. There's one crisis that has multiple qualities. You call it a capitalist crisis, ecological crisis, political crisis. call it a triple crisis if you want to combine them all into one thing. The world is going through a major crisis called a triple crisis. The movement, therefore, has to confront the triple crisis in all of its forms. So that's what we need. And the question is how. As for the first part of your question, I totally agree with you. There's this false universalization that occurs whenever we talk about climate. And we also see this with the problem of the concept of the Anthropocene. Many people on the left have noted this. It's a clear problem, and exactly how to confront it is not always clear, because on one hand, we on the left want to particularize, do justice to heterogeneity and difference and so on. On the other hand, the universalization can be useful in a way, because it is this lever that we can pull on to remind people that, like, this affects everyone. So let's pull that lever, because then that's going to be useful politically. So we're familiar with that debate. I just want to add one slightly different comment that I think doesn't perhaps come into the left thinking so much, but is again part of the theory of Climate Leviathan in the book, which is that this I'll call it false universalization, because I think that was the way you framed it. The idea that, we're all in this together. There's only one planet. We all have to live together. This is a ideological quality that we expect to become more and more prominent in global political affairs as a basis for a new form of politics. Specifically, we expect it to be mobilized by either the US or China or both as they work their way through the present interregnum. That is to say that whichever power comes out on top of this world struggle that's going on now between the two would-be imperial hegemons, whoever wins will be effectively attempting then to organize a new form of hegemony on a planetary scale. And they will use this idea that we're all in it together and we're here to save life on Earth. We have to anticipate that and figure out as a left what will our counter response be before it comes to that point.
Yeah, that makes sense.
We on the left, sorry, just to clarify, we haven't faced that problem before. Revolutionary struggles have often emphasized the nation/people. And of course, the great struggle of the 20th century around imperialism, colonization, pitted left-wing groups, demanding national sovereignty, perhaps anti-capitalism too, against the illegitimate sovereign, etc. But now this is a different frame of the political. We're shifting from ostensibly territorial-based frame where the ontological basis of the political, to speak political theory, is the nation/people, to one where we're shifting to the planetary frame, and where the emphasis is no longer on the people per se, but on life on Earth. It's a massive change, and it doesn't portend well for anything like what we call democratic arrangements of power.
Thanks, that was helpful. I won't know.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks. Great question.
Dory.
All right. This one's probably a little more selfish, a little more individualistic, but I have an opportunity in my city to work with a climate organization, or probably various climate organizations. A lot of them are taking the path that you mentioned in the book, that is kind of the green Keynesianism idea, where you get the state to get involved and essentially create a Green New Deal. You get municipal, provincial, state, federal governments do the climate action, not for you, but to be the primary driver of it. And to me, after reading your book and reading other leftist climate change related books, I feel like that's insufficient. Like, that's not going to get the job done in the time that's required to do it. So my question for you is, how would you propose an idea to these groups, or to the powers that be, in this sense, that is in line with Climate X, that isn't this Green New Deal, Green Keynesianism? Essentially, if you were me, how would you go into these groups while maintaining your values, but not coalescing to this, Climate Leviathan style of tackling climate change? And I hope that made sense.
Oh, no, it's perfectly clear. The only problem is I don't have any kind of answer for you, really, because so much depends on the specifics of your capacities, talents, and ideas as a person, and the specific relationships that you're going to have in those situations, as well as the political terrain you're operating on. So it's really hard to make very general abstract answers to a question like that without sounding like a total blowhard who knows everything, and I don't. What I will say is this: I think that because again, I mean, as a teacher at a public university, I teach 2 classes on climate politics. I have a lot of students who say things like, well, I don't know what to do because this job I'm going to get with such and so group isn't exactly in line with my politics. And I'm like, dude, I don't know any organization that's hiring right now that's totally in line with Climate X. And why? How could it be? Because I mean, look at fossil fuel capitalism in the USA. So if the best you can do is throw some energy into an organization that's operating on the terrains of Climate Leviathan, which is, after all, in a global battle with Climate Behemoth. Let's not forget that. Like we prefer Climate Leviathan to Behemoth. So there's that, right? But then at the same time, to try and use that space, and more importantly, the relationships that are made through the work to push the broader question: how are we really going to liberate ourselves from fossil fuel capitalism? And in my experience as an activist, those conversations really never go anywhere until you have been through the fire together. You know what I mean? Like, we talk about solidarity. Solidarity doesn't come cheap, in my experience. I mean, maybe people make friends faster than me or build, confidence more quickly or something. But like, in my experience, until you have really struggled with someone, been through meetings, talked with their, carried their children, I mean, the real life stuff, you're just not going to be able to have the deep kind of conversations that can lead to social transformation, including of yourself. So I would say walk the Green New Deal path, knowing it's totally wrong, and look for an exit ramp with other people, knowing that it's those relationships you build together that are the key. What is social change? It's about transforming relationships, ultimately, including relationships that are defined by capitalism. And that also means that, like, we all kind of work ourselves out of a job somehow, as if we're committed to an anti-capitalist vision. But you're not going to make that leap all at once. So, bon courage.
That's a great answer, Jory.
You're extremely kind, Pat. I don't know about that.
It made sense to me. I think deep down in my heart, I kind of knew that you do have to build solidarity with these people, even if they're not completely in line with how you perceive the solution to be, whether that's Climate X or whatever it may be. So, and it's tough work, like building solidarity.
It's really hard. It's hard. I mean, like, let's ask this question, like, why are people implicitly Keynesian? Because it isn't just about climate. If you look at the questions of poverty, if you look at questions of inequality, in just about every field of political and economic life, the so-called progressive or liberal or left, as we have it in the US and Canada today, has a political horizon that is defined by Keynesianism, even if they've never read a page of any text by John Maynard Keynes. And part of it has to do with the fact that they recognize intuitively that this system is in crisis, and they're afraid. And they're terribly afraid. And after the experience of Leninism and the 20th century, Maoism too, they're not on board with revolutionary anti-capitalist struggle. So rather than fight this, we have to just start there and say, that's where the people are who we need to talk with. Let's use the global climate crisis and the global capitalist crisis to see how we can think together, how we could work our way out.
That resonates a lot with me. Let's go to Zach.
Okay, I think pretty related, but how do you make like a model of degrowth, which I know can mean several things, but how do you make that palatable for, I mean, you mentioned how like no one really thinks that the proletariat is like inherently going to just conjure up all this will to confront climate change on their own, but how do you make some of the changes that are necessary, which I think could be beneficial to people. It can make everyone's lives better in a lot of ways, but there are changes that need to happen that I think the current outlook is pretty horrifying for a lot of people. The idea of reducing consumption, which is, I think, kind of the gross thing that needs to happen for a lot of people.
A great question, Zach. If I could perhaps quibble with this question a bit. At least in my experience, I find that young people are attracted to degrowth in a way that seems like that to them seems like a totally plausible idea, you know? I mean, take for instance, something like the politics of eating, local food production, urban gardens, veganism and vegetarianism. I mean, these ideas are not even, they're mainstream, right? And well, why did we win those fights? Which are not insignificant victories. You know, sometimes, you know, we like to say, well, you know, yes, but it's not bringing overthrow and it's, you know, it's not really being done right and so forth. All that is conceded, but we still have to, you know, every time we win something on the left, we have to like, you know, party a little bit because we don't win that many fights, really. So how did we win those? And I think it's partly to come back to your question, because those were things that somehow felt tractable, intimate enough, connected to the body perhaps, and where people could make that step, you know? So then, so that's good. That's good. But then unfortunately, that means that then that provides a kind of modality whereby everyone imagines how we make the next step. Okay, we'll do it just like we did with veganism, where we stopped eating chickens or whatever. But that doesn't really work with like coal-fired power plants, right? It's a different structure. You're going to need to struggle in a different way. You're going to need to organize in a different way. You're going to need a different set of ideas. And that's where that hard work of, you know, building a social movement around new ideas and so forth then takes. And when we get to that point, of course, what happens, the difference between just saying, well, I'm not going to, you know, eat beef, and saying my neighborhood is not going to have any more coal produced electricity, is that what stands between them is the state. So then you need a theory of like, well, how are you going to take over the state? And here comes old man Keynes, who says, yeah, capitalism is set against civilization. You want to save civilization, you need to re-regulate capitalism. And the way to do that is to use the state, in particular to its X, Y, and Z. And those ideas are incredibly powerful for many people. And then that becomes the implicit frame by which they examine all these problems. So we do have to confront the problem of Keynesianism as the horizon of the political. And that's going to be hard. Any other questions?
Hey, I'm going to skip the most controversial take. We don't need to do that. But Andrew, did you have a question?
Yeah, sure. But I just wanted to open up to anyone else because this is already my second question. Yeah. So if anyone hasn't asked.
Yeah, let's open it up. If anybody has any other questions, raise your hand.
But if not, in the meantime, I can ask my question. So Joel, I had a question about, so in the past decade, it seems like on the left, there's been talks, like on the left side, they talk about something called multipolarity. On the right side, they talk about Eurasianism. Everyone is kind of unified though by the sense of that unipolarity and American hegemony is going away. I'm curious how that fits, and especially it's been building up over the last decade, because I know with China's Belt and Road building up. Oh, sorry.
I need about a 30-second check-in with my.
Right on. Sorry, Andrew, that was good. Adam, did you have anything that you wanted to ask?
I'm okay.
All right, go ahead, Andrew.
Can I just make sure I got the question fully? Because I didn't forget. Yeah. I'm going to try and reformulate it in a more kind of blunt and simple way, and you can tell me if I'm doing justice. Essentially, the question is where is the world today geopolitically, and where is it going?
Yeah, and then also, and then I had a question about when it came to like, say, with Russia and China. Like, is it two Leviathans against each other? Because I mean, I don't know if I'm taking this too literally or not, but it seems
no, that's right.
I don't know if it's not necessarily a behemoth, but it does seem like another Leviathan. And because it seemed like in the book, it seemed like a Leviathan would be like a global thing.
Yeah, it has to be. So thank you for your question. This is a huge question, right? So I'm gonna answer it in a kind of broad brush way, and I hope that's okay. And then if not, we can follow up. So start with a few generic claims that many people have made before, and nothing original. We can recognize that the history of capitalism has some very distinct phases. And we are presently in a phase which, depending on which theorist you prefer, started in around the 1970s or around the 1980s, which is called the neoliberal phase of the history of capitalism, which is generally seen through a lens that emphasizes economics, finance, and so forth, trade, but can equally be registered in geopolitics, particularly after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the invasion of Iraq, and the period of US unipolarity. I happen to believe that, so the two thinkers who I follow most closely on the question of like the character of this present phase, which can be then interpreted for the specific moment we're in today, are on one hand Giovanni Arrighi, the great Italian political economist who was a brilliant historian of the history of capitalism and read geopolitics off of that history. And then second, a philosopher who happens to be from Japan named Karatani Kojin, who's made a very compelling argument that neoliberalism is a phase whereby we see a return to one side of a historical oscillation that capitalism's been moving through periodically since it formed between liberalism and a phase of imperialism. So this is, to sum up a complicated argument in one sentence, Karatani claims that what we call the neoliberal era, while it is in some sense a revival of certain classical liberal ideas in terms of governance and ideology, is actually in terms of geopolitics an era of imperialism. So whether you like Karatani or Arrighi, or my favorite would be to blend them together, where we're at today is in a very dangerous phase, which is on one hand marked by an interregnum. So the US is no longer a unipower, and it's clearly in a very dangerous position because not only is it kind of in its long-term decline, past the terminal point, as Arrighi calls it, of its hegemony, but equally, crucially, the ruling class in the United States does not have a coherent theory of an agreement, a consensus about how it should act. In fact, we have 2 or 3 competing camps right now, which is almost like if you were imagine you were in an aircraft and there was a mechanical problem and you thought maybe you could land it safely, but then there were 2 or 3 different people who wanted to pilot the plane and they were fighting in the cockpit. Like that would be bad, right? That's the United States at this point in history. Except the people fighting in the cockpit are called Republicans and neocons and conservatives and so forth and so on. So much for the US. And then meanwhile, you have rather extraordinary events playing out right now in Russia and Ukraine. We could talk about that, but it's a whole nother story, leading to an interesting question about where Russia is going. And then there's China, which of course is arguably the most important question in the world today and the one that really divides the left. What is China? What is China's relationship to global capitalism? How do we understand the problems of global capitalism in relation to the specific political and economic formulation we see in China? All issues I'm interested in and I've written some things about, but so those are kinds of important questions for all of us. But back to the topic of the book, what does planetary climate change mean for all of that? In the first place, it means that all of the leaders in these would-be struggling states that are trying to improve their position in the hierarchy of power of the world system are confronting, on one hand, serious environmental problems at home, while also recognizing that they have this problem that they have to coordinate their actions, or else the problems are going to get much worse, much faster. And clearly we can see, particularly in the case of the leaders of the Communist Party of China, Xi Jinping is just one of several in this line who have pointed this out, that they really regard global re-regulation of capitalism to quickly bring down carbon emissions, especially from those states that have historically been the biggest emitters, especially the United States, as a major priority. Maybe not quite as high as Taiwan, but like not very far down the list. Leading some people to the confused position that says that China is actually the good guy in all this, which is too simple. That's not my point. It's just that it's a different political and economic formation. Now to the punchline about Leviathan. Leviathan, you're absolutely right. It cannot be a territorial nation state. If something like a territorial nation state were Leviathan, our argument would be a total contradiction. Our claim is that Leviathan is like a path. It's a way of capitalism entering a different phase of history. So if I were to put it kind of pretentiously, I would say our claim is that basically Giovanni Arrighi was right, but that around the next decade or two, we're going to see a significant shift in the organization of the political in the long history of capitalism, so that we arrive in a new formation. And there's no reason to think that the old formation we had with these nation states that emerged around the same time as capitalism took hold has to stay forever. Capitalism can organize itself in different ways, and that's how it's going to respond to the planetary ecological crisis. And we may be wrong, and if we are wrong, then that means that Behemoth won, so to speak, in holding back the necessary progression of the history of capitalism to Leviathan. And that's a very bleak scenario, and that's possible. But those aren't the only possibilities, we would insist, because there are also these anti-capitalist options. But for us to avoid a Leviathan scenario, we would need something like a world revolutionary movement to emerge fairly soon in history. And it may be that doesn't emerge until we become farther along in this process. So having said all that, we did write a chapter of the book where we tried to kind of do the IR geopolitics thing a little bit and flesh out a little more clearly how we connected the dots between these things. And I think I have to say that that's the chapter of the book that it seems like most readers skip over, maybe just because it's chapter 6. And by that point, everyone wants to know like what we have to say about climate X, which I get. But I think also it's, it's a style of writing that's not for everybody. I'll put it that way. A couple colleagues and friends in the world of international relations who have read that have said essentially this is a really interesting argument, but not convincing, and I respect that. That's probably the place in the book where we make what is for many people on the left in North America today like the most unusual arguments. Yeah, did you read the stuff about space weapons? Yeah, did it seem like completely bonkers to you, or was it kind of like, oh, that's interesting? Okay. I mean,
I found it very interesting. Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Good discussions about that, I think.
Oh, right on. So, I get that, as a reader, I get the idea that how do you just drop space weapons into a conversation and not sound like you're an idiot, right? But, let's go back to the classics. I mean, both Marx and Engels make the argument in different places that you have to pay attention to the history of weaponry and the development of the forces of destruction. We remember these things like when war breaks out again. We're like, oh yeah, they're using drones now. Oh, who has the drones? Who has the best drones? And suddenly you're like, oh yeah, that stuff actually really matters for the material outcomes of political struggles, which is an unsettling thing to remember. Like for most of us, I just assume that I'm not the only person who's been thinking that kind of thing in the last 2 weeks, right? You start to pay attention, like, oh, yeah, that's right. Russia has nuclear weapons to destroy everything. Yeah, I guess they could use them in a so-called tactical way. Like, how does that factor in? And you start to think like that. And I think for most people, that thought process is so disorienting that you kind of throw it in the trash can of your brain as quickly as possible. You just hit delete because it's upsetting. And it's also a major challenge to a lot of kind of classical Marxist thinking about political economy, which Marx and Engels were keenly aware of, which is why they wrote about it. Because, of course, according to the standard historical materialist interpretation, it's the relationship between the means of production and the relations of production that are supposed to be determinate. So then someone comes in and say, yeah, plus weapons. It's like, well, wait, what? How does that factor in? So you can kind of get there by building a theory of the interrelationship of the specific form of technology we call weaponry. So then there's this whole school of Marxist IR that's tried to apply that kind of thinking to matters of the history of capitalism. And that's what we had in mind when we then turned and said, okay, let's take this hegemonic struggle that's playing out in the world today. We have the US versus China mainly. That's the headline fight. And then there's these subordinate fights about other like will Europe rally around Germany? And will NATO expand to the border? Of Russia. Will Russia reclaim its place? Will India come out of its hibernation? This kind of stuff that IR people do. Except that we decided to focus on this question of the interrelationship of the likely emergence of forms of governance specific to climate change, of which we think the attempt to control and regulate the incoming solar radiation is especially important, geoengineering, and the development of weaponry. And this is where I was fascinated when I was doing the research on this little piece of the book about 5 years ago, to find that the US military was all over this specific connection. I mean, there's a lot of writing in the US military about questions like how would we defend the satellites and the drones and the ships that would be emitting the sprays and the aerosols that would regulate the Earth's temperature. Look, whichever elite force in the world, whether it's a state or capital, whether it's China-based or US-based or some combination, whoever puts their hands on the thermostat and starts to change where and how much solar radiation comes in will be acting in the name of humanity. They'll be committing an act of a planetary sovereign. And that isn't necessarily going to enjoy universal democratic support immediately. And they're going to know that. So what are they going to do? They're going to try and defend their actions. And it will matter at that moment who has what weapons. It's a terrifying thought, I know. But the point here is this. Imagine if a state or in a group of people, an elite, a transnational elite operating in a deterritorialized fashion, had at one and the same time the means to regulate the incoming solar radiation and, on the other hand, weapons that could knock out everyone else's satellites and computers. That would provide potentially the basis for legitimation of the largest, most powerful empire in history. Look, they had to do it. They had to save life on Earth. And anyway, what are you going to do? Are you going to go blow up the ship? You and what army? You don't have space-based weapons.
Yet. But
that's right. But I know there's like 10 IT people on this call, and y'all are saying you do IT, but I know in your spare time you are working out anti-drone devices in your bathroom.
In Minecraft.
Strictly in Minecraft. Yeah, that's right. This is what you're doing in your free time. You're gaming out World War III in Minecraft, and you're preparing the forces of good against Climate Leviathan.
That's right.
That's right.
I want to ask, Joel, can we have you for another minute?
Yeah. So the interaction I just had with my partner means that I'm free for another like 20 or 30 minutes, actually. If you want to kick me up, you don't, it doesn't have to be like embarrassing. You'd be like, Joel, we've really heard enough now. No. You know, space weapons, you know, that's the point at which people are like, this is really insane. Like, let's just turn it off now.
No, I'm not having that response. And I do want to wrap up, and then we can chat afterwards if we want to for however long. But I want, before we wrap up, we do our little wrap up thing. I'd like to ask if there's anybody else in the room who's got a question for Joel based on Climate Leviathan, or if you haven't read the book yet, based on the topic of climate change and what we've been talking about this hour. Put your hand up if you got one. And if not, I'll ask one. A clarifying question about the question of the Climate X.
Oh yeah.
Scenario. What I gathered from that chapter is that there is something inherent about sovereignty that is unethical, or that is that we don't want as a future. Can you? But I'm uncertain about that from the book. Is that something that is sovereignty, something that is inherently bad? That's my question.
That's a great question. So this is one of those questions that if there is a fundamental question of political theory, I think that's it. Another species of what I think is the same question is the following. Must the people have a king? So essentially the left has two different answers to this question. On one hand, there's a tradition that says the people have to have a king, but the king can be the people through their representatives. And when they really do it right, you have government of the people, by the people, and for the people. Or if you prefer, volonté générale. Or if you prefer, revolutionary proletariat government. Those are all names for basically different left-wing Robespierrean / Maoist answers to that question. And we know what that looks like. Abraham Lincoln, suspends habeas corpus to defeat the South, and we cheer, yay! But he suspended habeas corpus, right? Mao says, power to the people, and then they wave the red book, and we cheer. Maybe not so much. You get the problem, right? So the second answer, though, is the one that Marx writes in his extraordinary essay on Hegel and the state, the philosophy of the state, philosophy of right. So this is in 1844 to 45. Young Marx is writing about the philosophy of right. And in a passage that has been, I think, unfortunately quite overlooked by a lot of Marxists because it doesn't sit well with the Leninist tradition, Marx says something unambiguous, which is that although a tradition that we've inherited equates sovereignty with the people and the arrival of democracy, actually understood, popular democracy is set against sovereignty. So this is a tradition that we might call, for lack of a better word, the anti-sovereign interpretation of left-wing politics. And that there is no king. There must be no king. So long as there's anything like a king, keep going. So that's a pretty simplistic way, I suppose, to think about the difference between what we call climate Mao and climate X, except in our schema, it's not quite that simple. Because we say that climate Maoism is actually a planetary sovereign, which leaves us with this ambiguity when we're writing it. And this is what your finger is put right on this pulse, this problem that we had, Pat, is when we were writing, that left us with a couple of options about climate X. We could say it is either in the tradition that I characterized as the Robespierrean, Lincolnian, Maoist one, Leninist one, but it takes the form of anti-planetary sovereignty, which would mean essentially that we'd continue fighting in the name of national self-determination for, things like that. We'd fight against Climate Leviathan as the people of the United States of America, as Marxists on the left. Or it could take a different form where, against the pretensions of Climate Leviathan, Climate X could take the form of people everywhere saying, no more of this new form of planetary sovereignty, but also no to the old. Which would mean, like, to take a concrete example in our daily lives, we're familiar with the radical demand that we should get rid of ICE and we should, overcome the borders and boundaries in our world, and we should adopt a radically anti-sovereign position on the question of personhood. And I think that we wanted to leave the door open for that, to my mind, more radical political position, which I think will become more pronounced as the years go by, specifically because of what we might call the genuine universalization brought on by the climate crisis. We talked earlier of the false universalization of the climate crisis. There's a genuine one too. That feeling that we confront when we realize that we're reminded of the natural history of humanity. Mike Davis, in a piece I gave you the link to earlier called Thanatos Triumphant, which was just published. If you haven't checked it out, I recommend it. It's ostensibly about Russia and Ukraine, but there's some great asides in there about climate change. And he says that, the cunning of nature is reasserting itself. For a long time, people got really comfortable on the left with the idea that history was, the determinant factor. And he's like, climate change is going to kick us on our ass. We're going to be reminded of what it means to be a species on Earth that's only been around 300,000-400,000 years. So this is a path of thinking that can easily make a hard right turn and end up in bad Malthusian land. What all I'm suggesting here is that there's a radical version of the thinking of the natural history of capitalism that leads us to the following conclusion, which is that capitalism was essentially a rearrangement of what it means to be a human being on Earth, a way of reforming society by value form that had all these incredible political and geopolitical consequences. There was a certain logic to the political formation that emerged out of that, which is usually called liberalism or the territorial nation state. That's now come into a major fucking global crisis. What's coming out of it looks like it's going to be this green Keynesianism plus planetary sovereignty. We call that Climate Leviathan. That is going to be a disaster for humanity. Is our best hope to fall back then on the Robespierrean / Leninist / Maoist way of thinking about struggling against that? Or do we have to arrive at a different conception of sovereignty adequate to the challenge? And our venture is that we do. Exactly what it looks like. We have no idea. Why don't we leave it at that? I hope that answered your question, Pat. All right.
It did. Wonderful. Thank you. and we're approaching the end of our time. We will wrap it up, and then we will go into what we call the parking lot, which is where people can hang out and chat if they want to, or take off if they need to. But before that, we will do something called reinforcement. Reinforcement is kind of the opposite side of check-in, where everybody's going to share something positive from the meeting, something they got out of it, something somebody else said, something from the book, etc., whatever. And then pass it on to somebody else to leave the space in a positive note. And start us off with Jory.
I mean, this honestly went better than I could have imagined. When I reached out to you, Joel, I had the lowest expectations possible. I 100% thought I would be rejected entirely. So I guess I want to reinforce the fact that we had you on today, that everybody asked really good questions. And yeah, I'm leaving this feeling inspired. Maybe it's just a momentary thing, but I'm going to cherish this moment here, and hopefully my work in my city can do something good, and we can go from there. But yeah, thank you, and thank you everyone, and I'll pass it on to Andrew.
Thanks, Jory. Yeah, thankful to the group. I've said this like a bajillion times before, but I've always said that this group is like college, but it's free. And it's nice, and you're actually a professor, so that's actually cool. And it's nice to have a discussion about climate change that isn't just doom and gloom. Nice to have some like political analysis, so thank you. And I'll pass it on to Keenan.
Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, no, thank you to the group. This is my first time attending a meeting, so what a meeting to join for. Thank you, of course, Joel. Love the book. And for me, it was good to sit with, like, a lot of the questions that were asked were stuff that, you know, while I was reading, I reflected on to like a much more shallow depth, but it was good that people were able to like voice these feelings and these like impressions that I had as I was reading. And then for you to take, you know, these questions, Joel, and run with them, it gave me a lot of clarity. So thank you for that. And thank you to the group. I'll pass it over to Adam.
Thanks, Keenan. Yeah, I really enjoyed listening. I reinforced just listening sometimes. And the idea of disruptive counter sovereignty, which is something that gets talked about, I think, in the Climate X section, which is really neat. I tried to think of I tried to formulate a question involving it, and I just couldn't figure out how to ask it. So I just listened, but it was great. I'm going to pass it on to Sarah.
Thanks, Adam. Yeah, I want to reinforce getting such a cool guest to come and answer questions about this book. I really appreciated the perspectives that the book had to offer. Sorry that I didn't get to hear the whole thing, but it's good. All right, I'll pass it to Zach.
Thank you, Sarah. I guess I'll just reinforce everyone who's out there doing stuff, including people here. Just in terms of like, I 100% agree that you do have to, you know, whether or not things are sufficient or pass whatever test, it's important to get out there and do stuff, because a lot of the work is just being out there with other people and building that group that will do the things that will pass whatever test you decide to impose upon your action. So I'll reinforce that action, all the people who are out there, because it's not always easy. Otherwise, I'll pass to Stephanie.
Thanks, Zach. I want to reinforce all of us coming together and having a great author speak today. I wish I would have made it through all of it, but I was working, and encourage more learning. That's what I want to reinforce. I'm going to pass it on to Drew.
Thanks, Stephanie. I guess I'd like to, I've never really known how to, I've never had clear thoughts about this, and I still don't, but I'd like to reinforce that now I have even more ways to think about climate change. So I'd like to reinforce everyone's questions and curiosity, because it has really been great. So I'd like to pass it over to Heather.
Thanks. going to reinforce Joel for being so open to criticism and for, bringing up specific criticisms by reviewers of the book that, frankly, we hadn't even thought of, just being so open about it. And your willingness to sort of interrogate your own ideas in front of us really sort of made me understand the book better. So that was great. And I'm really glad that this is being recorded so that we have a transcript of this, because this has been gold. I also want to reinforce Pat. It sounds like you're going through stuff. I have so much respect for you as a leader. I just think any society that can't figure out how to make use of you is screwed. But, pass it to Martin. Have you gone on already? Yeah.
No, I haven't gone yet. Yeah, I guess I'll reinforce the same thing. It was I haven't read the book, but you definitely made it sound interesting. It was interesting to hear, like Heather said, hear like criticisms of the book that I wasn't even aware of, not even having read the book. So it's interesting hearing that from the author. I was in the bathroom, so I don't know who's gone already.
Patrick, Varn, and Joel, and myself.
Okay. Varn?
I'll reinforce the analysis of the book. I actually use this with Sean KB of Antifada as an analytical tool in comparison with Fossil Capital. Those two books together were our analytical tools in trying to conceptualize the likely state responses to climate change and what people could do about them and why. I've already used your work and I'd like to thank you for that. I haven't found it as useful for activism yet, but mostly because my activism isn't entirely in the climate change field, although I every day emphasize that they're all three related, or 4 or 5 crises that we're going through right now related. So with that, I will throw to Pat.
I reinforce Joel for taking the time to talk to us today. I got a lot out of this, and I really appreciate your willingness to come on and just talk so so thoroughly and so eloquently about this topic. It legitimizes our project here when we have people like you on. I really appreciate it, and I reinforce all you guys for participating tonight, and the Real Shit Group finishing another book. We did it. Let's pass it to Patrick S.
Thanks, Pat. Yeah, I'll just reinforce everybody for showing up. It was a good conversation. I think it clarified some of my thinking on a few things, which is really nice. And also that we talked about how solidarity is really something that takes a lot of time to build. And I agree with that. And I think it often does need to have real world consequences to really be meaningful. But I think this sort of group asking questions about things that are going to affect all of us eventually, no matter what we do, can start that process. So yeah, thanks to all of you for showing up. And is anybody else left?
That's us.
Cool.
Joel's sharing his screen. Schizophrenic. You're muted.
Zoom rookie errors after 2 frickin' years of this, like first, I can share that if you want, but that's another story. But I was kind of feeling a bit overwhelmed actually by all the nice things you guys were saying. And so my brain was agitated. So I was like, doodling around here. I mean, what can I say? I'm just thrilled that the book was of some use to you, and that this conversation may have helped some of you think about things differently. That's the most important thing. So I can't thank you enough for the opportunity to engage and talk. Since so many of you mentioned the criticisms of the book, and I don't know, maybe, I think that's kind of useful. I pulled up I have a 4-slide sequence that I used at the end of the class I taught this fall about climate politics because of, so, there's this dynamic when you're a teacher and then, you share something you've written, and then, there's some students, they're just, they can't criticize it basically because, you're the teacher. So to kind of help break the ice, I put together like a 4-slide sequence where I taught the students the criticisms of the book in the most open way I could. So if anyone's curious, I can show you what the experts say about why the book is so fucked. If you're curious, I'll show you because it is kind of interesting. So should we do that, or should we just call it a day? Or what do you, Sarah?
Do it.
Okay. All right. So I'll try and keep this short. Can you see the screen?
Yes.
Right. So you're seeing my friend Bob Cohen, who might not be a household name to you, but he's one of the most cited living scholars in the world for international relations, and is generally regarded as one of the fathers and doyen of a school called liberal internationalism, which, as you might guess, is not a Marxist school of thought, quite the contrary. But nonetheless, Bob is a really interesting person because he's one of the only people in the field of political science and IR in the US who's been writing about climate change for a long time. And incidentally, his son is one of the major leaders of domestic environmental groups on climate politics. So he read the book, and because we know each other, he wrote me an email, and he said the following. He was very direct. He said, "You correctly say on page 133 that the challenge of all climate futures centers on the political," meaning this phenomenon of the organization of politics as such. In chapter 5, you criticize green Keynesianism on the grounds that politics makes it impossible to realize. The conclusion with which I agree is that any green Keynesianism will be highly unequal, incorporating power and domination. From this, he concludes, but when you turn to Climate X, you are schizophrenic with respect to political feasibility. To be fair, you point out your own contradictions, and indeed they make me side with Climate Leviathan, because from my standpoint, both Maoism and Behemoth are morally unacceptable. So here we have a very frank and I think clear explanation from a political theorist as to why Climate Leviathan, in his view, must win. And incidentally, his point about the schizophrenia of Climate X is, I think, a reflection of the point, which I think Pat made earlier about this feeling when you get to the end of the book, like, are we saying we need a sovereign which is not planetary sovereign, or are we saying we don't need a sovereign at all? The truth is that Jeff and I don't know the answer to that question, and therefore we tried to finesse it as writers, and that has been, I think, legitimately represented as we don't know what we really need, and hence we get this phenomenon. And I think that, okay, this is just Bob Cohen, he's just one person, but I've run into a lot of this kind of thinking that leads me to think this is part of the reason why many on the left in general do in fact continue to push for green Keynesianism. It isn't just about because that's what's winning, it's also because at some deep level they believe it's the only winner in town that isn't morally unacceptable. So that brings me to another person who ends up in a similar position but is far to the left, a brilliant political theorist named Elissa Battistoni, who is now no longer at Harvard. Actually, she's in New York City at Columbia Barnard, where she teaches political theory. So she was one of the first to review the book. She reviewed it in the magazine The Nation, which, as you may know, is kind of a mainstream left liberal / social democratic magazine in the USA. And her review concluded, while Mann and Wainwright and other supporters of a possible Climate X need not draw blueprints, some hard questions demand answering. How is the massive global fossil fuel industry to be dismantled without state coercion? How would an anti-sovereignty, anti-capitalist movement prevent the enormously wealthy from decamping to some reasonably stable patch of the world? How are massive boycotts and strikes going to be not just imagined, but organized? All valid questions. Certainly, she says, many on the left are too blithe about the state, presumably on grounds that sees it first and then asks those questions later. But her conclusion to this is to ask the question then, how can we transform the state rather than finding ourselves transformed by it? In other words, the logic here is we're not going to be able to get around the state. We don't have time to make an anarchistic utopia. So we have to accept that this struggle is going to be on the terrain of Climate Leviathan. And then therefore what that means is we have to find a way of transforming the state, not us, which again points to the same conclusion. Implicitly, what this means is that we're going to be fighting for a Green New Deal, and we're going to be fighting for a different kind of capitalist state for the medium term, which is ultimately, I think, where Elissa, even though she is a Marxist, lands, as you can see from checking out her recent book, co-authored with some friends. So then there's this position which is represented in my slide here by Holly Jean Buck, but has been taken up by other people, including Andreas Malm, as I mentioned earlier, which is to say that if you really look at geoengineering and where we are today as a planet, that too is going to bring us back to Climate Leviathan, because we simply can't not geoengineer at this point. I mean, essentially the argument is that the liberals who are saying that the time has now passed whereby we could decarbonize global capitalism are correct. And we're pro-science, so we should accept that that's what the science says. Just like we don't say, well, I don't want to wear a mask, so fuck the science. We say, okay, if the science says I have to wear a mask, I'll wear a mask. For the same by the same logic, we have to accept that we're going to have solar radiation management. So Holly Jean Buck in her book doesn't explicitly criticize us, but at one point she comes pretty close. And between us, I think that she had us in our crosshairs. Legitimately, I'm not being defensive. I just mean, like, keep that in mind here. So she says, within the environmental movement, industrial technology is still seen like dark satanic mills. Technology and capitalism are conflated. So when it comes to geoengineering, many environmentalists have a simple refrain: we don't need geoengineering, we need X. This X might be sustainable ecological agriculture or system transformation. Geoengineering just serves as the foil for the beautiful X, the blossoming future we really want. I mean, that's clearly climate X. And we are anti-geoengineering. We do think that planetary geoengineering is not going to solve our problem. And the thing is, like, Holly Jean Buck has some strong arguments which have been repeated by others. Let me just mention one. If you go and you look at the most recent set of models that came out of the IPCC 1.5 degree report. So not to go deep into the technical gibberish, but basically the IPCC put out a special report after Paris to allow politicians to see, like, okay, if you say you're going to get to 1.5 degrees maximum global mean temperature increase, this is what you got to do. And except for one scenario, which is like outrageously optimistic, called P1, all of the other scenarios presume that there's going to be, significant negative emissions. That's represented here by my little red rectangles. Negative emissions on the order of 10 to 20 gigatons CO2 equivalent per year. Nothing like that exists in the world today. The implication of the science here, again, without going into the nitty gritty, is we are not going to have a 1.5 degree Celsius world at this point unless we have massive amounts of carbon capture and storage or some equivalent. And none of those things exist yet. So from a left-wing perspective, the argument is we better get on board with developing these things, but we need a left-wing strategy to do it. That's the position that they represent. And politically, I think what that means more than anything else is that the left is going to endorse solar geoengineering. So last year, the National Academy of Sciences in Washington came out with a major report called Reflecting Sunlight, in which it essentially said, this is coming and the United States government needs to get behind this. Quietly, the Biden administration is supporting this, as are many of the environmental groups. And this is not a theoretical problem or issue for us anymore. The things that we discussed in the book prior to this report have been validated by recent actions. So where does this leave us with, that's from my class. The other alternative is Mao. And so this is my friend Arun Saldana, who teaches at the University of Minnesota. And he's one of a number of people who have basically looked at these other positions and said that's all, unfortunately, insufficiently anti-capitalist. He does come down on the side of the revolutionary anti-capitalist Climate Leviathan, in other words, Climate Mao, but he questions whether we use the right name and also whether Maoism, as it's historically existed, is anything like a model. So as he put it in a paper where he criticized our book, he wrote, excuse me? Oh yeah, that's what happened. Technical difficulties. Take two. Just kidding. You know what? It doesn't matter. That's good enough. Enough teacherly nonsense. Stop the share. Let's come back. Punchline is, thanks. The punchline is that, to repeat basically in a different way what I said earlier, he's not convinced that Maoism is the right metaphor, even though he's not anti-Maoist, you see. And the specific reason is simply because Maoism was never a stable ideology, was never a stable political position, not for the man named Mao Zedong, not for other people as well. And so therefore you have a problem anytime you speak of Maoism. Which Maoism are you speaking of? And essentially he's saying, in the main, the ones that we're discussing are not pertinent for the struggle that we face today. Okay, anyway, I hope that was of some use. But if nothing else, I think what you'll see is that, and I hope this doesn't seem like a defensive reaction, but kind of more of like an analytical conclusion, is that those first three criticisms, which have been repeated in various forms, all show in one way or the other why we need to get on board with Climate Leviathan. And that's what we mean as Gramscians when we say it's hegemonic. It is the leading idea. It's winning already. We have to own up to that. And you could even hear that in my answer back to Jory's question before, when I was like, yeah, work with the Green Keynesians. That's where we are. It's another version of saying that's the hegemonic idea or conception of the struggle today. Okay. I hope that
Okay.
was some use.
We are now in the parking lot. Feel free to hang out and chat for additional chat or take off if you need to.